Hi, this is Chris from Orange Coast College's Art Department. Today covering using photo textures to add realism to digital paintings. Now, I usually like students to start out with basic primitive forms to wrap their textures on. So what I thought I'd try to do is a crate of dragon eggs. And we've got a little bit of sort of spheres, we've got boxes, we've got cylinders. Here's a reference photo from Game of Thrones, and I think we might do something like this. Now, normally I'd start with a sketch, but in this case what I decided to do was do a quick little model in SketchUp. And this is the composition that I want to work on. I created that model, moved the camera around, and then saved out a few different formatted images. And I can use this for line work instead of a typical sketch on paper and then scanned or a digital sketch. So this represents the elements in the composition. Again, we've got some cylinders, we've got some boxes, we've got some almost spheres, and we've got some flat planes. And those are great things to start with for applying digital texture. So let's look at the line work. And so I've got just lines here on a gray background. And because we're applying textures and we want to build this up in layers, we want to use indirect painting, meaning we want to work in grayscale and then apply our colors through stacked layers in groups. So in this case, I want to start out and figure out what are my light sources. So I did a quick little sketch of where I want light coming from. And we've got these pillar candles on the left, and that'll be where our key light is. And in my model, but not really shown in frame, is a sort of, I don't know what they call them, wood torch kind of barrels. And so in the foreground, out of frame, there's some firelight. And then I want to have some rim light or some backlight, and I want it to contrast a little bit. So I'm just going to pretend there's an open window here at night with maybe some moonlight that's out of frame as well, but deep in the background. And we can get a little bit of some blue rim light from that. And that's what we're seeing here in this layer. Now, I don't need to leave this layer on. I just want to have it for reference and keep me honest once we start applying some lighting scenarios. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And the next step really is to just work through the whole composition and fill in grayscale values. So what I'll do is go in there and apply a value to most of the primitive forms and start to add light to them so I can figure out where my highlight shade, core shadows, cast shadows would be. And I'll do this sped up. Okay, and I wanted to start with the eggs because everything else is going to work sort of relative to that. So I think that's a nice place to begin the value study. Now let's move on to the box, table, candles, background. So my approach here is to essentially construct the box by having a layer for every surface of the box and the lid. And I'll end up locking visibility on those layers so I can paint freely on them. And then also I'll pay attention to how the layers are going to stack so I can be loose with my selections and knowing that when one area is going to be hidden by another area in the layer stack. So in this instance, that lasso is pretty wide to the bottom because I knew I didn't need to worry about it because the fronts of the box was going to cover. Now we've got pretty much the eggs in the box handled with values. So let me turn off the line layer. And this is what it looks like, assuming the lighting scheme discussed earlier. So we've got some key light on the left, a little bit of low fill light from the front, and then we'll come back with some rim light for the upper right. Next, let's move on to the table and kind of work our way stacking layers as we would foreground to background. And I think we have a pretty good idea what that might look like. So much like the box layers, my process here is just to make selections that indicate different objects in different planes and shade those with the approximate lighting in the scene. So each object gets its own layer, and sometimes if something has multiple sides, I'll break out multiple layers per. But for the most part, I'm making selections, painting within that selection, and while it's still active or while it's masked, I'll be free with airbrush to give light to the form. In this instance, I wanted to bring in a couple reference photos for some pillar candles. I encourage you to always have reference photos for what real-life objects look like. And I'm just sort of banging my way through making candle after candle and trying to figure out how they might light each other up, both internally and externally. On the hard objects, I'll tend to use a polygon lasso, and then on the objects that have curves, like the candles and the candlesticks, I'll often use the freehand lasso. You'll probably notice that there's not really much texture right now because I'm just going after the form lighting, knowing that the object of this exercise is to bring in textures, and that after the textures are brought in, I'll have a final pass of over-the-top painting to knit everything together. Then at the very end, I forgot about this bowl over here on the right, and I'm trying to find the right selection tool, and I ended up using quick mask so that I could use round brushes to actually do the selection. So that's it for part one, giving me light and value on form. And we'll pick up again in part two with color and texture.